Hello and welcome back to our first panel of the day, state-sponsored environmental diplomacy beyond the Paris Agreement. Well, as Robert Dry has duly noted in his address to us this morning, regardless of the increasing importance of non-state actor and grassroots diplomacy, the future of environmental diplomacy will continue to be heavily impacted by the conduct of diplomacy between nation states. Our speakers for this panel come to this topic from a variety of disciplinary perspectives, and in so doing, lay the foundation for a nuanced consideration of our theme. Following the three presentations of our speakers, questions will be posed to our panelists, which have been submitted by our audience members via the Q&A portal, which you can find at the bottom right hand of your screen. I invite you to please submit your questions as they occur to you so that we can pose them to our panelists. So let's now turn to our speakers, and we have a wonderful slate for you right now. We're going to begin. Our first speaker will be Lawrence Susskind, who is the Ford Professor of Urban and Environmental Planning at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Boston, where he teaches negotiation, international environmental policymaking, and water diplomacy. He was the founding director of the MIT Harvard Public Disputes Program, as well as the not-for-profit Consensus Building Institute. He is one of the co-founders of the Inter-University Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School, where he is currently Vice Chair for Instruction, Director of the Teaching Negotiation Resource Center, and lead instructor for executive training programs in advanced mediation, and the Negotiation Masterclass and Negotiation and Leadership. Professor Susskind has advised the United Nations, the OECD, the World Bank, and numerous national governments on environmental negotiations, and he is the author of 20 books, including Environmental Diplomacy, Negotiating More Effective Global Agreements, published by Oxford in 2014, as well as Negotiating on Behalf of Others, published by Sage in 1999, and Multi-Party Negotiation, also published by Sage in 2008. Professor Susskind joins us today from Boston. Welcome to you, Larry.
Thanks for the invitation, the chance to join. I very much enjoyed the previous session, which I was listening in on. I have 4 questions that I was asked to comment on in about 15 minutes. So I will take that assignment literally. How is the growing visibility of the environmental crisis modifying the priorities and problematics of the work in our field of environmental diplomacy? I noted with some concern that Ambassador Dry did not mention justice concerns in his long list of things that are on our environmental diplomacy agenda. I would argue that the new focus on environmental justice in many parts of the world within and among countries requires a more urgent attention in the making of all bilateral, regional, multilateral agreements. And I think you also heard from Mr. Dry that we need to have a greater sense of urgency with regard to climate change and enhancing resilience. And I would argue that whatever treaties are made, environmental or other, should take at least some time to include what they can in the treaty, whatever the treaty is about, to try to do what they can, do the best they can to contribute to enhancing resilience. And there are lots of ways of building into trade agreements and to all kinds of other agreements, measures that will simultaneously enhance resilience and, of course, sustainability. So the answer to the first question for me is we need a new focus on environmental justice, much greater emphasis on the justice implications of the agreements we make among countries and within countries, fairness, justice, the distribution of results, not just the obligation to share burdens going in. Second question I was asked is, what are the most fruitful strategies for promoting collaboration among different practitioners of diplomacy and other interlocutors? This is a topic that I've spent a great deal of time writing on and pursuing. And I would argue that informal diplomacy, or what I've called parallel informal negotiation. And there's a published article in Stanford Law Review. If you look at my name and Professor Martinez from Stanford Law School, parallel informal negotiation. You take some of the formal negotiators who are going to go to a session like the upcoming one in Scotland, bring them together in their personal capacities with other unofficial actors, including those with scientific and technical expertise or with experience as advocates for particular points of view. And that group, not officially designated as a subcommittee of the formal negotiating body, meets to generate what I would call good ideas. What are good ideas? Ideas that meet the interests of all the parties present. So the parties present need to express their concerns, their interests, in a pre-meeting conversation with neutral team, and that assessment of those interests becomes the agenda for the group that's meeting on a particular question that will be coming up in a formal negotiation. Parallel informal negotiation. The representatives of countries have the option of attending unofficially in their personal capacity. They're not representing their country. They are just in a problem-solving conversation to generate good ideas. Again, good ideas being proposals that could then be considered in the formal process. I've also written about a concept called informal devising seminars. Call them seminars so that officials can come without having to have formal permission, because it's not a negotiation with other countries. And yet when they get there, there are the people who will be the formal negotiators from other countries, but they're there in their personal capacity, again, with participants who are unofficials from different parts of the world and from different sectors, advocacy groups, business groups, all of whom are working to generate a new representation, a new framing of what issues need to be addressed in formal diplomacy. They can engage in joint fact-finding so we don't have the battle of scientific experts from different places when formal treaty negotiation happens. So my answer to the second question is we need much more by way of informal problem-solving conversation amongst the people who can and should participate in negotiations, but need not be formal designees of their country for the purpose of meeting to do problem solving. Third question was some of us on the panel are practitioners and others are scholars. In what ways do you understand your work to be diplomatic? I've not been appointed by any government to represent them, so I'm officially not a diplomat, but I'm often a citizen diplomat or a science diplomat or a university diplomat. I'm not sure that's very different from being an advocate for some institution that would like people who share the interests of that institution to participate in problem-solving conversations, not formal decision-making, but problem-solving conversations that can reshape the agenda of formal decision-making, can offer new options and choices for formal decision-making, can bring together coalitions that in their formal role, first, they wouldn't have a chance to meet and form a coalition, but even if they did, that coalition would then just be reacted to by another coalition. But along the way, I provided negotiation training to the G77 in environmental diplomacy. You heard in David's introduction, I've often been involved with training. I have designed the Foreign Service Institute advanced negotiation training course. It's basic, redesigned its basic negotiation training course. There are a lot of ways those of us who are unofficials, maybe citizen diplomats, can assist in framing issues, in providing basic skills, in generating shared reflections on what has happened so that institutional and organizational learning can occur. I do teach science diplomacy with colleagues from UNITAR. Anybody who might want to be interested in a one-week course in science diplomacy next June can check the UNITAR, the UN Institute for Training and Research website to see about science diplomacy training. Where does diplomacy need to go now in order to adequately address the depth and breadth of the environmental crisis? To both summarize and add just a little bit more, I think multilaterals of all kinds, official, intergovernmental multilaterals, but multilateral business organizations, multilateral environmental organizations. I use the term to just mean coalitions that have formal institutional operations and longstanding interest in issues. Groups like that need to take informal devising seminars and parallel informal negotiation opportunities more seriously. They need to create those opportunities. And if you invite someone from a country who's an environmental diplomat who's going to attend Scotland meeting to something, they can't come unless their country decides that they should represent their country. But if you invite them as an individual, you have to pay their way. And you have to, I would argue, find a nice place to meet and create opportunities for them to meet with colleagues who they'd love to talk to, but they can't officially. But if people are there in their personal capacity, all kinds of opportunities are open up, not to negotiate formal agreements on behalf of their country, not to represent their country, but to engage in collaborative problem solving, reshaping the agenda, engaging in joint fact finding, reframing ideas, good ideas that you know in advance people can participate in supporting. I think we need to use trained facilitators or mediators in all of these informal sessions. I have argued with UNEP that every meeting of multilaterals, every meeting of intergovernmental organizations ought to be professionally facilitated. I know we need ambassadors to chair those sessions, but the preparatory work, doing assessments of the interests of the different parties and how they flow together or flow differently, and preparing those materials in a neutral way, and then organizing working groups instead of formal speechifying the entire 2 weeks of a COP meeting. That should be handled by professional facilitators, and there are many, and they can work in teams representing all the different parts of the world. It's crazy not to take advantage of skilled facilitation and to make all these meetings problem solving, not just speechifying. And finally, we ought to be committed to the idea of joint fact finding on every global environmental issues. We don't need to have everybody going off and doing science in the name of their political interests. What we need, and we've seen what's happened if the IPCC does science, that's fine. When it writes an overview that makes prescriptive recommendations, then it's doing politics. And then that undermines the strength of and the support for the independent scientific work. So we should be encouraging all groups of countries regionally, all groups of countries with shared concerns in certain issues to be engaging in joint fact-finding, just understanding the issues, the science on those issues, the technical matters, how they disagree on them, what additional joint fact-finding they'd like to see, and then the work of science would not be politicized and would have a chance of being included, not deciding anything, just taken into account in a constructive way. I think that's my 15 minutes. I'm happy to take any questions that you want to put my way.
Professor Susskind, I cannot thank you enough for getting us off to such a wonderful start for this panel. And you've really given us a lot of terms and concepts to embrace and reflect on. I'm going to take parallel informal negotiation and informal devising seminars with me to my next gathering. And thank you for your presence here today. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, people are invited to put in questions into the Q&A tab at the lower right-hand part of the screen. And at the end of the three presenters' talks to us, then we will turn to those. So let's now turn to our second panelist, and that is Phillip Stalley, who is the endowed professor of environmental diplomacy at the Gray School of Applied Diplomacy and an associate professor of political science here at DePaul University in Chicago. His current research focuses on China's environmental diplomacy and its approach to international environmental institutions. Prior to joining DePaul, Phillip was a visiting research fellow at Princeton University in the Princeton-Harvard China and the World program. He also served as a visiting scholar in the Environmental Economics Department at Fudan University in Shanghai, and was a member of the Public Intellectuals Program of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations from 2011 to 2013. Dr. Stalley is the author of Foreign Firms, Investment, and Environmental Regulation in the People's Republic of China, published by Stanford University Press in 2010. Dr. Stalley joins us today from Chicago. Welcome, Phillip.
Let me start by saying thank you to David, Jeffrey, and everyone behind the scenes for organizing this conference. This is a 3-day conference with speakers in multiple time zones. And so I'm sure it was a lot of work to put this together. And I just wanted to express my appreciation for all of your efforts, and also to thank you for inviting me and giving me the chance to share my own thoughts and to learn from my fellow panelists. So thank you for doing this. So as David indicated, my background is in Chinese politics and foreign relations, and my recent work has focused on China's climate change diplomacy. And that's where I'm going to focus my remarks today. I'm going to focus on China's climate change diplomacy and its relationship with the United States in that arena. As Dr. Susskind mentioned, David has given each of us 4 questions to structure our conversation, and he just went through them very systematically, but just for the sake of clarity, I will paraphrase them here. The first question, and I'm also going to reorder them. The first question is, where does environmental diplomacy need to go? Second, how do we get there? In other words, what strategies should we adopt to push diplomacy in the directions we think it needs to go? How do I see my role in that process? And how is the environmental crisis affecting my work and the fields in which my work is situated? So I'm going to focus primarily on the first 2 questions. Where does environmental diplomacy need to go, and how do we get there? And I'll try to conclude with the latter 2 questions, but if I don't have time to get to them, hopefully we can discuss them a bit in the Q&A session. So let me start with that first very large question. Where does environmental diplomacy need to go? In the context of Sino-American relations in the climate arena, I think there are 3 big tasks for diplomats. The first is to put the overall US-China relationship on sounder footing so that we can take advantage of the society-to-society relationship that we've spent the last 40 years building, which we need in order to address not only climate change, but other global environmental challenges. The second big task is to do whatever we can to persuade both China and the United States to take on more ambitious climate targets and policies. And the third task for environmental diplomats is to assist or facilitate the implementation process of existing policies and targets. So I'm going to talk about each of those 3, and along the way, I'll do my best to suggest some strategies for how we can achieve them. So let me start with the bilateral relationship. I think really the primary task for diplomats in China, the United States, and elsewhere is to find creative ways to reduce the tension and the hostility that has come to define US-China relations over the last decade. Now, I know this is an environmental conference, and so a discussion of Sino-American relations is a little bit outside the focus, but I think it's worth mentioning just briefly for the simple reason that I think, as we all know, environmental diplomacy takes place in a larger political context, and that context can either facilitate or hinder cooperation. And to use the language or the jargon of international relations theory, forging strong environmental agreements often requires a sufficiently hospitable contractual environment. And that's just another way of saying that the political setting needs to be one in which the actors have enough sense of goodwill and trust that they can negotiate with reasonable ease and costs, that they can make credible commitments, and that they can monitor one another's behavior in implementing those commitments. And unfortunately, today, the US-China relationship, when it comes to the US-China relationship, the contractual environment is most inhospitable. In fact, it's not an exaggeration to say that US-China relations are as bad as they have been in my lifetime. And I was born about the time that Nixon went to China. This tension in the overall relationship is making environmental cooperation more difficult. John Kerry, President Biden's climate envoy, just gave an interview last week or maybe 2 weeks ago in which he was pretty frank and stated this, saying that the hostility in the relationship is making his job more complicated and more difficult. In meetings with Kerry and other US diplomats, the Chinese officials have consistently refuted the US position that climate cooperation should be a standalone issue and that it should be walled off from other disputes in Sino-American relations. Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, stated last month that the American side wants to see climate cooperation as an oasis, but that the Chinese can't ignore the desert that is around that oasis. And what Wang Yi and Beijing are saying is that, at least to some extent, cooperation in the climate arena is contingent upon US policies and actions in other areas of China-US relations where there is a lot of dispute, like trade, human rights, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong. So the bottom line, what I'm saying is that the route to more productive environmental diplomacy has to start with addressing the deep-seated problems in the larger relationship. So let me turn to the second task for environmental diplomats, and that is, here I'll focus a little bit more on the environmental side. This is an environmental diplomacy conference, and so I know I'm preaching to the choir when I say this, but it is critical that environmental diplomats in China, the United States, and elsewhere convince both China and the United States to put forward stronger policies to combat climate change. I think most of us, all of us know that the aim of the international community, as reflected in the 2015 Paris Climate Accord, is to keep the increase in global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, while also making efforts to keep the increase to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius. And it almost goes without saying that there is no plausible path to either 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius that does not involve both China and the United States, the two countries that collectively contribute roughly 45% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And recently, over the last year or so, China and the United States have made some progress. For instance, since the 2015 Paris Climate Accord, China has put forward some targets, some important targets for controlling greenhouse gas emissions. Most notably, it has what are commonly referred to as the 30-60 objectives. That is, it aims to peak carbon dioxide emissions before the year 2030, and it aims to be carbon neutral by the year 2060. And that's important, and it's notable that China, a middle income country that has only really very recently risen above the ranks of the poorest countries, has put forward these targets. But the problem is that neither of these targets are consistent with getting us to well below 2 degrees Celsius. In fact, they're soft targets that reflect the Chinese tendency in international negotiations to underpromise so that it can overdeliver. So if we're going to get to 2 degrees, China is going to have to take more robust action, as will the United States. And there's a whole host of things that China can do. I don't have time to go into them, but one of the things it'll need to do is move forward those peak targets that I was just talking about. 30-60 really needs to be something more like 25-50. So there's a lot that China could do to increase the ambition of its climate pledges. And I think it's the job of environmental diplomats across the world to help persuade China to do so. Now here, I guess I have to offer a caveat and say that we have to be realistic about the impact that diplomacy can have. That's why I was very interested in the first panel in which we were talking about that, the impact of diplomacy. It's my sense that the history of Sino-American relations, not just in the environmental realm, but across the board, shows that Americans and American policymakers especially have an outsized sense of our ability to influence China's course. China's climate policies, just like the United States, are going to be determined largely by domestic factors. Domestic factors like the desire of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party to remain firmly in control of Chinese society. The CCP, the Chinese Communist Party's desire to maintain economic growth and energy security, and the party's desire to dominate future industries, including green tech and all forms of clean energy. But caveats aside, the world is not powerless in influencing China's climate policy. China's climate policy over the last 3 decades has responded to, and in some cases been pretty significantly shaped by, external forces, including diplomatic pressure, NGO advocacy and activism, and scientific exchange or exchange with experts. And we can see the influence of diplomacy just in the last year in some of the declarations that Xi Jinping has made in the climate arena. Just over a year ago, he made the 2060 carbon neutrality pledge that I mentioned just a moment ago. And just last month, he announced that China is going to cease funding or building overseas coal. Both of those declarations represented a response to external pressure and demonstrated a concern with China's international image. It's not a coincidence that he made those announcements, not in front of a domestic audience, but in front of international audiences, in fact, in front of the UN General Assembly. That shows that there is a real strong interest in protecting China's international image, which does provide some leverage for diplomats. We can also see the impact of diplomacy historically in the fact that China has moved on climate when, one, the United States has increased the ambition of its own actions, and two, the United States, Europe, and other countries have consistently engaged with the Chinese through diplomatic channels. Perhaps the best example of that is the 2014 summit between Xi Jinping and President Barack Obama. This was a summit in which both countries announced joint pledges for reducing or controlling greenhouse gas emissions. And it's largely credited with laying a foundation for the success at Paris a year later. Now, again, I don't have time to go into it, but this summit, these announcements were the result of years of patient diplomacy, primarily through the SNED, the Strategic and Economic Dialogue in the Obama years, but even that was founded on the Strategic Economic Dialogue, which was started under the Bush administration. So what I'm trying to say here and illustrate with these brief examples is that when Europe and the United States take action at home and when they engage China diplomatically, good things can happen. Now, the implication, of course, is that those of us, people like me, and I'm sure many of you who are sitting here thinking, I really want China to take more action when it comes to controlling greenhouse gas emissions, the task for us is to advocate and push our own governments, in my case, the US government, to take stronger action. Because if the United States can't get its own house in order, it's going to be much more difficult for it to influence China. All right, let me turn to the third and final task for environmental diplomats. And that is, as I said, facilitating the implementation of the existing pledges and policies that we've already put forward. And here in my thinking, I'm moving away from the politics of Washington, D.C. and Beijing, and really away from what you might call the traditional state-based diplomacy. I'm thinking more about the role, for instance, of non-traditional diplomats like subnational actors, governors, mayors, cities, states, as well as the whole range of non-state actors that contribute knowledge and skills and expertise to the diplomatic realm. This is the trans-professional diplomats in the language of the Gray School. Now, they're not accredited or formal diplomats, but they nonetheless have a lot to offer in terms of supporting and influencing state-to-state relations, and as I said, helping both countries achieve their climate goals. And let me try to illustrate my point with just one, again, brief example, looking at the subnational level on transportation. So here in the United States, if we're going to achieve President Biden's climate goals, one of the things that we need to do is electrify the transportation sector, right? We need to move from gas-powered automobiles to electric ones. And that includes not only private cars, but public vehicles as well, such as municipal bus fleets. So California alone is going to have to acquire something on the order of 100,000 electric buses over the next decade or so. Now, there is one country in the world that has sufficient scale and experience in both building and deploying electric buses, and that is China. There are something on the order of 500,000 electric buses in the world today, well over 90% of which are in China. You have cities in China like Shenzhen, which has something on the order of 16,000 electric buses that have almost entirely electrified their public transportation system. The largest Chinese manufacturer, BYD, Build Your Dreams, has delivered 50,000 units, whereas as of 2019, the largest North American manufacturer had delivered about 500. So implication of this disparity is that this is just one area where there is ample room for Sino-American cooperation, as well as ample room for the United States to learn from Chinese experience. Again, I would take it a step further and say that if the United States is going to realize its climate goals, its own climate goals, it's going to have to work with China. I think every city, every municipal transit authority in the United States should be planning a learning and listening tour to Shenzhen or other similar cities. There's 27 American states that have representative offices in China. That's more than any other country. These states should be using their presence in China to gather knowledge, to learn from Chinese experience, and to do what they can to broker deals between the United States companies, American companies, and Chinese manufacturers so that we can hasten the transformation of American industry. I'll take it a step further, and I think the transportation authorities in the United States should be hiring people with Chinese language skills or people who have spent time in China and are familiar with the business and the political climate so that those authorities are better equipped, again, to learn from the Chinese experience. So my larger point, what I'm trying to illustrate is that expanding people-to-people exchanges and multiplying the connections and the bonds between our societies is a necessary element in helping both countries achieve their climate goals. Now, how can we do that? This gets back to the question that David asked us about strategies that governments can adopt to promote collaboration. And I kind of fear that my answer to that question is either overly simple or a cop-out, I'm not sure, but I actually don't think we need to do all that much other than, and this is a big but, get geopolitical tensions and security concerns as out of the way as possible. And the reason I say that is because I think there are natural constituencies in China and in the United States that are eagerly looking for ways to cooperate in order to better understand and to resolve the climate crisis. There's scholars and students that want to study everything from clean technologies to environmental law to environmental regulations and business practices, environmental health and safety practices, all for the purpose of trying to figure out what works and how it can be employed across the world. Obviously, there's businesses that want to develop new technologies and sell them in one another's markets. There's civil society actors that are eager to advocate for stronger policies and to promote public-private green initiatives. And there's, as I was just talking about, subnational actors that are looking and can find ways not only to cooperate to implement existing pledges, but these subnational actors, especially in China, are often the laboratories where new policies can be experimented with and developed. So to return to my original point, I think if we can decrease the tension and push aside some of the hostilities in US-China relations, there's a huge amount of energy that we can unleash in terms of promoting society-to-society connections. Okay, I fear that I'm already over my time limit or right at it. So I don't think I'll have time to get to those other two questions that David asked us. I apologize for that, but I do have some thoughts on them. So if you're interested in hearing them, just put them into the Q&A and I'll do my best to address them. So with that, I'll stop and turn it back over to my fellow panelists. Let me just say thank you for your time. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for calling attention to the very outsized percentage of the environmental problem that is being provided by two countries, so one of them being ours. And so I really appreciate you putting that front and center. And I hope that we can take a number of the points that you brought up into our Q&A. And with that, I will remind people again to please submit your questions via the Q&A tab at the bottom right-hand part of the screen. And we'll be looking forward to sharing those with all three of our panelists after this next presentation coming up. And so now it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Marcela Lopez Vallejo Olvera. She is the professor and researcher at the Department of Pacific Studies at the University of Guadalajara in Guadalajara, Mexico. Her research focuses on global governance, climate change, and transregional convergence. Her career has included postings at the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs and at the Ministry of Public Education. She belongs to the Mexican National Research System and is part of the Editorial Council of Latin American Policy. Professor Lopez Vallejo Olvera is the author of multiple publications, and her two latest books address climate governance and environmental policy in North America, including the volume Reconfiguring Global Climate Governance in North America, a Trans-Regional Approach, published by Routledge in 2014. Professor Lopez Vallejo Olvera joins us today from Guadalajara. Welcome, Marcela.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Thanks to the Gray School of Applied Diplomacy for the invitation. Thanks, Professor Wellman. It's an honor to be here. Thanks, Professor Noe Cornago. I see you're there in the chat. Thanks for the invitation. And I'm very grateful of participating with you because I've been here since yesterday. And the discussions have been really insightful and really different in terms of proposing where to go from now. So as well as and following the lead of my predecessor, Phillip Stalley, I am only going to focus on two of the four questions you addressed, especially on the how, meaning the strategies in general of diplomacy, of climate diplomacy, and the where to go after Glasgow, right? So I'm going to share a presentation up until what extent do we believe in the dilemma of state diplomacy versus agents diplomacy. Yesterday, the discussion went that way in both panels on how and if other agents should be diplomats, should be considered as representatives of any institution, as giving voices and votes in several institutions as diplomatic representations. So my argument here on the presentation is that is a false dilemma right now. Maybe some years ago, some decades ago, there was a clear division between state, or as I call them, foreign service diplomats versus other agents, as Ambassador Dry just mentioned in the morning. However, today with the technology, with transnationalism, with networking, I guess this is a false dilemma. So just to contextualize, and I'm sorry if you're watching the presentation in a different format. Okay. So just to contextualize a bit, there is, after 30 or plus years of climate diplomacy, taking into account the foundation of the IPCC, we hoped to have important achievements, right? However, reaching the Glasgow conference in next month, we see that the goals and the actions and the results are not consistent among each other. If you see in this map, if you focus in a truly integrated region, which is North America, each of the countries have different approaches to net zero goals, to mitigation, being Canada the only one putting it into law, in the United States, well, in the policy document, and in Mexico, well, we're just not thinking about that. So in this context of having a lot of institutionalization globally and nationally and even locally to operate all the climate governance, that results in technical, in a very straightforward aspect, which is reduction of GHGs or distribution of, as Professor Susskind mentioned, climate justice finance or climate justice concept as in general, we have not really done so well, right? So what do we need? What kind of diplomacy do we need to overcome today's inconsistency between goals, actions, and results? And then we need to address how state-centric and transnational approaches to diplomacy merge together or compete or substitute each other. One of the house or strategies that has always reached, established highest expectations for conferences like the Conference of Parties every year is state diplomacy sponsored leadership and open spaces. Open spaces, as you see in the picture, like G7, as Professor Susskind was saying, in informal institutions as G7. In this case, Professor, not parallel, however, very influential globally, and other types of spaces, as we saw in last April in the climate summit of sponsored by the United States. Leadership and open spaces, state diplomacy is one of the key answers to negotiation, besides or in preparation for the Glasgow COP26 or whichever other climate governance institutional and formal meetings. However, this is not enough for me. All these discussions have led to a little bit more technical issues on the agenda of the discussion of COP26. Here's a list of things that are thorny and that will be, at the core of the discussions. How to create a global carbon market, how to address loss and damage for less developed or countries or most vulnerable countries, how to distribute the green fund, who will get the money and what criteria will that be to do so, and how to regulate certain certain sectors, especially the aviation one through the agreement, of course, yeah, or the linkage with the energy sector, knowing that the energy sector does not have a global governance approach. It's considered still a business sector. So to transform that into a global governance to produce public goods is kind of far away from what we are now. So state diplomacy, of course, we need more ambition in these topics, etc. But shall we think a little bit more on what Professor Phillip just mentioned, or should we be more realistic? Because we each year increase ambition, we put new nationally determined contributions, new pledges. However, we're not there yet. So in my mind, the answer is to get out of this false dilemma that states propose ambition against or parallel to other types of pledges of other agents of diplomacy. How to become more realistic? Well, that is just some ideas based on my previous work on transgovernmental networks and transnationalism. For example, we are discussing how to create a global carbon market, harmonizing with methodologies, putting a global price on emissions, or preventing double counting or other aspects of it. However, we do have effective carbon markets already in place. Some of them are, as Ambassador Dry mentioned, subnational. the California, Quebec, and New Scotia agreement, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, China's ETS, now in progress, started, as I'm sure Professor Stalley could talk a little bit more about it, started subnationally, and the ETS of the European Union and others. So I guess the argument of for global problems, global solutions now here in our context is not enough. So we need global problems, transnational solutions with whatever we already have in place and seems to be working. The discussion of Article 8, loss and damage, that is the typical discussion, and we heard something about it yesterday, about cooperation. So I guess if we don't transcend the aid approach, the assistentialism approach, and even the division of North-South cooperation, we won't at all get into an effective distribution of resources under Article 8. What do I mean by transcending the aid approach and the North-South divide? First of all, well, different sorts of cooperation are now in place, led by different diplomatic agents. And the North-South division is very relative. You know, this concept is very popular in international relations academia. However, I guess it's in my view, it doesn't address the differences of the segregation of states, the vulnerabilities, the exclusions, and the poverty within the North-South divide. For example, there's a very, very impressive case of cooperation between a province, a Chinese province, Sichuan, with a province of Poland called Lotski, in which, well, in the typical North-South cooperation, the Poland would be the north and Sichuan the south, but in this case, it's the other way around, and they both profit from this cooperation. So we no longer know who's south, who's north, and I guess that's good, right? Because we are into a different sort of cooperation or collaboration based on needs, interests, and opportunities for different agents. Also, another approach that would benefit the discussion on Article 8 would be to introduce or to acknowledge the very important role of transgovernmental networking. Most of the agreements are dealt with, are negotiated or operated by transgovernmental networks, bureaucrats to bureaucrats, technicians with technicians, right? So if we don't acknowledge that kind of network of contributions to that networking, we will not be able to transcend, this very hierarchical approach, as Professor Antonio Vallejo mentioned yesterday, to climate diplomacy. Some other ideas to transcend and to articulate a little bit more the very state-centric approach of climate governance, global governance, formal global governance, is to address regulation of value chains in free trade agreements, for example, which is not really, an issue still of deep discussion into the negotiations. And the last one is to prevent fragmentation. We were listening, and some of you are experts on other sorts of environmental issues. For example, I don't understand why we still think on a climate governance, a water governance, a forest governance, etc., oceans governance, if all of them are indeed intersected and interrelated into a planetary system, right? So, and I really don't understand either how the Sustainable Development Goals would be implemented if they are fragmenting and overlapping topics among each other. So maybe the next panel on urban diplomacy, environmental diplomacy would address how to achieve the goal of sustainable cities without achieving the rest of the sustainable goals. I'm going to go through some images illustrating these very different points on how different diplomatic agents are being collaborating with or competing with the state diplomats, and their contributions had been really important to open up, as I mentioned before, open up spaces even virtually or physically. Well, then here you're seeing two pictures. The COP23 in 2017 was the first time that there were two official delegations of the United States. One called for clean fossil fuels through carbon capture and storage, and the other one for decarbonization. And of course, the diplomats were very different. The USA one, the USA one delegation, the clean fossil fuels, would be represented by state diplomats, and all these people of the gas, coal, and oil companies into the official delegation, and the decarbonization delegation represented by the governor of ex-governor of California and the ex-mayor of New York. This dynamic repeated itself in COP24, COP25, where there was one delegation of the United States and some other diplomatic agents in these two conferences, including social movements as the Coalition Under 2 Degrees, or we're still in, which is very important in the United States. And this is very important. This picture here is very important because there was an implicit, or as some of you mentioned, informal acknowledgement of Patricia Espinosa here, that other diplomatic agents are important and can contribute to the agenda of of climate change. Some other issues that that we need to take into account is, as I mentioned before, we have already ETS performing around the world. Some of them, as in North America, well, they're subnational. And Mexico, we are still designing our ETS, and we signed an agreement of understanding with the California, Quebec, and the RGGI market. So we are I'm not sure if consciously or not, we are promoting this transnational approach to at least green markets. Some other examples, I have only 1 minute. Cooperation in Mexico has been opening itself to different forms and formats of cooperation. I'm sorry, this is in Spanish. This was a report made by our cooperation agency, AMEXI, measuring the number of and types of cooperation. And as you see, well, we have decentralized cooperation, academic institutional cooperation, non-governmental networking, border cooperation, triangular cooperation, increasingly developing in our country. So with the permit or license or even promotion of the National Cooperation Agency. Decentralized cooperation in Mexico is definitely aiming for environment. It's environment, urban development, and arts are one of the pillars. Are the three pillars of decentralized cooperation in Mexico. And well, just to finish, to wrap up, some other, apart from CORSIA, we need to open up the discussion of how deep trade agreements are including every time new policy areas. As you see, well, this is not disaggregated into topics. However, as you see in the darker bars here, more and more trade agreements include different policy areas, one being one environment. So just to wrap up, I would like to leave you with some ideas and questions for the discussion. Shall we think on different types and degrees of diplomatic craft and practices, as it is clear that state diplomats are not the same as governors or NGOs or even think tanks? When do they complement, compete, and substitute each other? Shall we identify hierarchy, power, and politics in all diplomacies? Acknowledge that formal agreements, institutional and fora, will privilege only state diplomacy? Shall we address effective and localized communication both ways to bridge the gap and through training? So all these questions or ideas, I think we can address it a little bit more in the discussion if we have time. However, this is all I've got. Thank you very much, and I'll leave the floor for the panel.
Marcela, thank you so much for such an engaging talk. And there's so many strands of what you had to say that really caught my attention. But among them, of course, is this incredible opportunity we're being given to bridge the North-South split in a different way, based on our common environmental reality and our need to work together. So I want to now call attention to a question that has been posed by one of our master's students, Jean-Stéphane Nas. And this is a question that I would like, I can see that Larry's already started to answer it, and I believe Phillip is too, but I want this to be one that everybody can hear. And so may I pose this question and then ask that our speakers, in the order that they have appeared, Larry, Phillip, and Marcela, if you would be so kind as to take a shot at answering this. So Jean-Stéphane asks, state diplomacy has had some success in establishing international climate agreements. While governments set ambitious targets, they rarely meet them. How can these governments be held accountable to their commitments? In your estimation, would track 1 or track 2 diplomacy prove most effective as a mechanism of accountability? That is a very big question. And so let's turn now to our first speaker.
I'm a big believer in track 1.5, as Jean-Paul Lederach proposed decades ago. An informal parallel negotiation that I mentioned involves state actors and non-state actors. And in the case of the question that's asked, we need monitoring. We need global monitoring. We might need regional centers of a global monitoring network. We need a negotiated agreement that involves states as to what indicators ought to be used and what monitoring procedures should be used. But then those need to be implemented, I would argue, by a combination and maybe even an over-reliance on non-state actors, particularly scientific networks. And that information needs to be immediately and completely publicized. And we can monitor a lot of things through the air now that we never could monitor. So there's no issue of intrusion into some country's space to gather the data, although you could model this on amnesty, and every state could have a non-state organization that's a member of this global collaborative that's monitoring everything that needs to be monitored through the air, completely open source, but there needs to be a negotiated agreement as to what will be the indicators and what should be the monitoring protocols, or that the various publics won't be able to use the results of the monitoring to hold their elected officials accountable.
Thank you very much for that answer, Larry. Phillip, What do you say to this?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a difficult question to answer and to answer concisely. I guess I'll push back. Okay, I'm just going to talk about China because that's the only thing I know about. But I'll push back a little bit on the premise of the question because so China has its 5-year plans. We're currently in the 14th 5-year plan that covers 2021 to 2025, and it puts forward different energy targets and climate targets more recently in those 5-year plans, and it does tend to meet them. And then those targets get reflected in its international commitments. I think the problem is, as I said before, is that the plans they don't go far enough. The problem is that China burns more coal than the rest of the world combined, right? And China's cement and steel industry creates more greenhouse gas emissions than all of the EU, right? So it's tough because China is a developing country, and it's as I said, it's a low middle income country, but it's also the country that has to move the most. So I think the aim has to be not just getting China to implement its targets, but to increase the ambition of its targets, right? So a joint study between international and Chinese scholars came out that said, look, technologically, China could phase out coal in the 2040 to 2045 period, right? But to do that, it has to start setting targets for phasing it out, right? The only goal it has now is to phase it out or is to peak it by 2025, right? And there's something on the order of 250 gigawatts worth of coal plants that are approved, under construction, in development in China, and that's enough energy to power Germany, right? So it's you have to have pressure to increase the ambition of the pledges. I think, at least when we're talking about China. How do we do that? Track 1, track 2. Climate change, it's an all hands on deck moment, right? We need pressure coming from all points. So diplomats need to raise these issues in international forum. As I said, the United States, of course, has to get, as I said before, its own house in order because that increases its leverage. But some of the stuff that Dr. Susskind is talking about informal meetings and stuff behind closed doors and all of those kinds of things between diplomats and non-diplomats or between diplomats, that also matters, right? And, guard is down, people talk more openly as opposed to just delivering talking points. And that can be really important. So I didn't highlight it in my talk, but my experience with Sino-American relations would make me very much nod my head in agreement with a lot of what Dr. Susskind was talking about in his presentation. I'll stop there, sorry.
Thank you very much, Philip. Marcela.
Yes, well, that's a very important question, because as soon as we open up the space to transnational actors, it is more difficult to monitor and ask for accountability. And this is why we not need to romanticize, transnationalism, in my view, because, well, as we all know, all NGOs and all sorts of non-elected agents have no one to respond to, right? So everyone has their own agenda. They survive through funding. So I am not sure how transnational would account for to the state diplomacy. I guess I don't have an answer, like straightforward answer. However, we need to address that there are some agendas of transnational agents which will not be willing to accept certain standards or others. So to avoid this and maybe answering, going a little bit ahead of, we need to have a global governance or different governances all over. I guess for monitoring and accounting, we do need a global governance approach. Because if not, private interests, private meaning not only companies but NGOs, would certify different sorts of, for example, carbon markets, standards, offsets, and other sorts of instruments. So that is one approach, to have a global institution, maybe from coming out from the COP or the UNFCCC. Secondly, how do we ask for accountability, how do we say to the publics that there is monitoring, there's accountability? I guess yesterday's panel was very insightful in terms of how do we communicate the results or the science or the achievements. And we need, and I'm totally agreeing with Professor Susskind, to have to have a very clear instruments to translate it both ways, from politics to science, and to science to politics, on how to go further, right? Because we don't understand each other. If we don't understand within our professional areas, professional ivory towers, right? How can we expect to be understood through the typical channels of each of the professions? So we need a global approach to monitoring, and secondly, we need to be more creative on how do we communicate this accountability.
Thank you very much, Marcela. So we've got a number of questions coming in, and I'm afraid we probably only have time for one more. So I want to pose to this group a question from Noé Coronado, who comes to us from Bilbao, and I want to suggest that we reverse the order of answers. So after I pose this question, let's start with Marcela, then go to Philip, and then Larry, if you can bring us home. So Noé writes, congratulations and many thanks to you all for an extremely interesting and enlightening presentations. Here comes my question. The pluralization of environmental diplomacy is surely both a matter of fact and a necessity that national governments and multilateral institutions are increasingly prone to accept. But it seems, as Professor Wiseman underlined yesterday, that its performance and delivery is increasingly complex, networked, multi-layered, and both public and private, and thus, apparently at least, more resistant to lineal trajectories of progress than expected. Shall we accept this? Or do you foresee a more integrated and organized global system of global environmental governance?
Okay, so shall I start?
Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Noé. I guess, we're in the time of the spaghetti bowl approach. So, and I don't think we will escape from that anytime soon. So my answer would be, well, maybe we should not only accept it, but work with it. One of the arguments I made in the last part would be to acknowledge where power is in that interrelation of transnational diplomacies, because we don't have one. We have a lot of schemes, a lot of governance structures, a lot of complex networks intertwining among each other. So first of all, we would need to acknowledge where power is, where hierarchies are, to establish first priorities, and then important and more effective channels of communication. So my straightforward answer would be, Noé, that is here to stay. In my view, in the near future, and with technology, with virtuality, with everything, it would be very it would be unthinkable for me to escape and go back to a global homogeneous scheme to address climate issues.
Thank you very much, Marcela. Philip.
Okay, that's another great question, and one that's difficult to answer with a quick response. I think that, yeah, we have to accept it. That is the nature of environmental governance today, that it is polycentric, right? That there are multiple overlapping levels of authority. There's a kind of spontaneous bottom-up quality, and that's a good thing. That's kind of what I was talking about in my presentation about if we can get security concerns out of the way, there's plenty of societal groups that are willing to play a part in the role of environmental governance. So I don't think it's the case that all aspects of climate governance have to be kind of painstakingly designed by diplomats and other government officials. I think that that we accept that as I said, environmental governance is multi-layered, and that's not a bad thing. I think that's actually a good thing. My concern, as I keep talking about, is that the problems in Sino-American relations are kind of undermining the potential of that.
Thank you very much, Philip. Larry, you have the last word here.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. I think if you focus on the stages of environmental diplomacy, agenda setting, the formulation of policy options and the study of them for purposes of decision-making, monitoring of those decisions, and then learning based on the monitoring of how the earlier agenda setting process all the way through worked or didn't work. You can think about the role of the system of governance that we have now, formally in terms of state actors. And you can also probe and see there's already enormous opportunities for non-state actors to be involved at these different stages. I agree with Marcela. I don't expect decision-making to devolve or transform into some new kind of hybrid in which non-state actors have authority. We're a system created in Westphalia and we're stuck with it for the foreseeable future. But we can change the decisions. We being all these other multi-centric or pluralistic or more democratized actors, by being organized differently from the way we are now. I don't think we need to be authorized to be organized differently. I think that action can be taken by all kinds of non-state actors to change the way the agenda is set. We have hundreds of global treaties. We can have many, many more. COPs meet periodically, but what happens between those meetings changes what happens at the COP. And what happens after could change what happens at the next COP. So all of the people listening should, I think, be thinking about ways in which institutions, organizations, governmental, non-governmental, that are not the formal state decision makers, can play crucial roles at every one of these steps, using new technologies through new coalitions of the kind that both Philip and Marcela were suggesting. A coalition playing a role in these different stages has a bigger impact than just any single actor. But they're still not the actors making the final decisions. I don't expect that that structure to change, but we can alter what comes out of it.
Well, on that note, I just want to express my profound gratitude to all three of you for a remarkable panel and the privilege of hearing you respond not only to the original questions we posed, but the questions from the audience, and then your exchanges between all of you. It's a conversation that I would very much like to continue, and I hope that you will, if you are able, be able to join us for the following panels. But thank you so much. So Lawrence Susskind from Boston, Phillip Stalley from Chicago, and Marcela Lopez Vallejo from Guadalajara. Thank you so much. I now want to suggest that we can take a break now. We are going to come back at 30 minutes past the hour for panel 4, entitled Urban Diplomacy and its Contribution to Building Social, Economic, and Environmental Sustainability. Until then, we'll see you soon.